The camera opens on a gray dawn over New York City in the mid-1930s. Steam rises from the streets, the elevated trains roar overhead. It is a city of ambition and corruption, where every handshake hides a blade. In the distance, a newspaper boy calls out the headline, "Crime Kingpin Faces Life Sentence." The name splashed across every front page is Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the man who ruled an empire built not on territory but on order, fear, and vision. The voiceover begins softly, almost reverently. It tells of how America created its own kind of aristocracy, not from blue blood but from the alleyways of immigrant neighborhoods. Luciano's kingdom was not marked by thrones or crowns, but by the scent of cigar smoke and whispered deals in dimly lit backrooms. He was a man who believed that power could be controlled like an orchestra, if only the players could be disciplined. Yet as the camera lingers on his eyes, cold, intelligent, and weary, we sense something else, a man who knows the weight of his sins. The same system he built to outsmart the law has now turned against him. Prosecutors have painted him as the embodiment of organized vice. The public sees him as untouchable, a mythic figure whose fall feels impossible. But beneath the headlines and the bravado, the truth is far more human, and far more dangerous. The narration dives back in time, reminding us that this story is not just about a gangster, but about America itself, a nation torn between morality and necessity. The same country that condemned Luciano would one day come begging for his help. But at this moment, in 1936, he stands alone in the courtroom, hands clasped behind his back, his face carved from stone. He listens as the judge's gavel comes down like a gunshot. The sentence is brutal, 30 to 50 years in state prison. The king of New York's underworld is going to rot behind bars. The film slows, dwelling on the contrast between the cheering public outside and the silent calculation behind Luciano's eyes. The man they call Lucky doesn't panic. He never does. He knows that survival isn't about strength, it's about adaptation. It's about waiting for the world to need you again. Cut to the crowded dockyards of Manhattan, longshoremen unloading crates, sailors exchanging nervous glances. The war clouds in Europe are gathering, but few in America can see how this will change everything. Luciano can. Even in prison, his instincts remain sharp. Somewhere deep in his mind, he senses that his story isn't over, that history itself might still have a use for him. The narrator draws a parallel between the world of gangsters and the world of nations, both built on alliances, betrayals, and secrets too dangerous to ever be spoken aloud. As the scene fades, a line from an unseen voice, an investigator's note or perhaps a journalist's whisper, echoes over the city skyline. Some said he sold his soul for power. Others said he saved the country that tried to destroy him. But one thing was certain, Lucky Luciano understood the game better than anyone else. Because he helped invent it. The screen darkens to black. The faint sound of a ticking clock grows louder. The voice concludes, almost in a whisper, promising what's to come, that buried beneath the myth of the Mafia Don lies a secret pact, a devil's bargain that changed history. The music swells, the title fades in, and the story truly begins. Sicily at the turn of the century was a land shaped by hunger, pride, and ancient codes of silence. In the narrow streets of Lerca Afridi, a small village baked under the Sicilian sun, the Luciano family dreamed of escape. Poverty was not a misfortune there, it was a birthright. The soil was thin, the work brutal, and the future predictable, one could either labor or steal. When Salvatore Lucania, the boy who would become Lucky Luciano, was born in 1897, he entered a world where the law was mistrusted and power came only through cunning. His father, Antonio, was a humble sulfur miner, worn down by years of labor. His mother, Rosalia, dreamed of something better for her children. In 1906, when little Salvatore was just 9, they boarded a ship bound for the New World. The voyage to America was both a promise and a warning. The Lucanias arrived in New York City, joining thousands of other immigrants packed into the tenements of the Lower East Side. Here, amid the smell of coal smoke and sweat, young Salvatore learned the language of survival. The neighborhood was a patchwork of cultures, Italians, Jews, Irish, Poles, each fighting for a piece of the American dream. Crime wasn't a deviation from the system, it was a reflection of it. The strong rose, the weak vanished. School bored him. Authority irritated him. By the time he was 10, Luciano was skipping classes and running errands for street hustlers. He found power in small acts, gambling pennies, carrying messages, intimidating kids weaker than him. But he wasn't reckless. Even then, his mind worked like a strategist's. He studied people, the bullies who ruled the block, the shopkeepers who feared them, the cops who looked the other way. Every glance, every exchange taught him that fear was currency, and that those who understood it could control men twice their size. When Luciano was still in his teens, he met a boy who would change his life, Meyer Lansky. Lansky was Jewish, quiet, analytical, the opposite of the fiery young Italian. But together, they saw beyond the crude street wars of their peers. Where others saw chaos, they saw opportunity. They began to imagine crime as an enterprise, structured, disciplined, and profitable. It was the birth of a friendship that would later reshape the entire criminal landscape of America. Luciano's early arrests read like a resume in the making: petty theft, gambling, assault. Each time, he came out sharper, more cautious. In reform school, he learned patience. On the streets, he learned loyalty was a lie unless it was bought. By 17, he was already running small rackets and building a crew that respected his intelligence as much as his temper. He dressed better than his peers, spoke less, and observed more. In a city obsessed with appearances, Luciano understood that respect could be manufactured, with the right suit, the right gesture, the right rumor whispered in the right ear. But America was changing. Prohibition was on the horizon, and with it would come a new breed of criminal, businessmen in fedoras, not thugs in alleys. Luciano was ready. His early years had forged him into something the old world Mafia could never have imagined, a hybrid of immigrant grit and American ambition. He didn't want to rule a neighborhood, he wanted to run an empire. Behind his charm, though, there was darkness. He had been beaten, humiliated, and betrayed enough times to understand that mercy was weakness. The code of survival he built inside himself was simple: trust no one completely, and always be useful to someone more powerful. When he worked for gang leaders like Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masuria, he played the loyal soldier. When he moved with Jewish associates in Manhattan's bootlegging scene, he became the cosmopolitan negotiator. Every identity was a mask, and behind every mask was the same calculating stare, the boy from Sicily who would never be poor again. He earned his nickname, Lucky, after a brutal kidnapping and beating left him half dead on Staten Island. No one expected him to survive. But he did, scarred, changed, and colder. Some said the attack was punishment for crossing the wrong people. Others whispered it was fate's way of marking him, giving him the myth that would follow him for life. From then on, he cultivated the image of a man blessed by destiny, untouchable. In truth, it wasn't luck at all. It was resilience, intelligence, and a willingness to become what the world demanded. By the 1920s, Luciano was no longer just a street hustler. He had become a student of human behavior, fluent in fear and persuasion. The immigrant boy who once ran errands now dined with politicians, gangsters, and nightclub owners. The path to power was open, and he intended to take it. But beneath his rise lay something deeper, the unspoken lesson that had followed him from Sicily to New York, that in a world built on lies and survival, morality was a luxury for the safe and the rich. For Lucky Luciano, survival was morality. The section closes with a shot of the Lower East Side skyline at dusk, laundry lines stretching between brick buildings, the distant glow of the city beyond. Somewhere inside one of those rooms, a young man sits by the window, cigarette smoke curling into the night. He's already plotting a future where the rules of men no longer apply, only the rules of power. The Lower East Side of New York in the roaring 1920s was a city within a city, a living organism of noise, greed, and dreams. The streets pulsed with life, vendors shouting in Italian, neon lights flickering over crowded bars, the rattle of trolley cars blending with laughter and gunfire. To the police, it was chaos. To Charles, Lucky Luciano, it was opportunity. This was his arena, a place where laws bent under the weight of ambition, and where a clever man could build an empire from nothing but nerve. By this time, Luciano had matured into something rare, a gangster who thought like a businessman. He didn't waste bullets where a handshake could do the job. He saw every corner boy, every crooked cop, every political fixer as a potential piece of a larger machine. But there was still one problem: the old Mafia families, ruled by stubborn Sicilian traditionalists, saw America as just an extension of their feudal world. Men like Joe Masuria, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, ran their crews through fear and blood, not strategy. Luciano played the loyal lieutenant, but inside, he was already planning the future, a future that would have no room for outdated kings. In the bars of Little Italy, Luciano learned how to read men like open books. He could tell within minutes who would sell loyalty for money, who would crack under pressure, and who would die for pride. He knew that to survive in this jungle, one had to understand human weakness better than anyone else. His charisma drew people in, his ruthlessness kept them in line. Underneath the charm, he was building a philosophy of control, one that valued structure over chaos, profits over heritage, and alliances over ethnicity. He began to form quiet alliances that defied tradition. With Meyer Lansky, the Jewish mathematical genius, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the volatile enforcer, Luciano saw a vision of a new kind of power, one not bound by blood or birthplace. Together, they studied how the city worked from the inside, how police precincts were bought, how judges were persuaded, how politicians depended on criminal money to fund their campaigns. They learned that the line between government and gangland was thinner than anyone dared admit. Then came Prohibition, the golden age of organized crime. In 1920, the Volstead Act outlawed alcohol, turning America's thirst into a black market gold rush. Every gang in the city scrambled for control of the lucrative bootlegging trade. For Luciano, this was not just a business, it was a chance to reinvent the criminal world. While the Irish mobs and old Sicilian bosses fought over neighborhoods, he thought bigger. He saw a national network, supply chains, distribution routes, and logistics. Smugglers would bring liquor from Canada, Cuba, and the Caribbean, local gangs would handle delivery. He envisioned an empire that operated like a corporation, efficient, profit-driven, and silent. Luciano's rise during Prohibition wasn't just about money. It was about positioning himself as indispensable. He became the bridge between rival factions, Italians, Jews, Irish, turning enemies into business partners. People began to see him not merely as a gangster, but as an organizer, a mediator. Violence, in his world, was a tool of last resort. "Make them need you," he once said, "and they'll never try to destroy you." Yet, power attracts enemies. Joe Masuria, the old world don, began to see Luciano's independence as a threat. In those years, loyalty to the wrong man could mean death. Luciano played a dangerous game, pretending obedience while quietly aligning himself with Masuria's rival, Salvatore Maranzano. The city's underworld divided itself between these two titans, and New York plunged into what would be known as the Castellamarese War, a bloody, ruthless conflict that would change the Mafia forever. During this war, Luciano's true genius emerged. While others killed for pride, he maneuvered for position. He met secretly with both sides, gathering intelligence, reading intentions, and predicting betrayals before they happened. To the police, it was just another gang war. To Luciano, it was evolution, the death of the old ways and the birth of something modern. But even Luciano could not escape the violence entirely. In 1931, after months of bloodshed, he made his most dangerous move yet. He arranged a meeting with his boss, Joe Masuria, in a Coney Island restaurant. As Luciano excused himself to use the restroom, gunmen entered and gunned down Masuria at the table. It was a clean hit, surgical, almost businesslike. The press called it the end of an era. Luciano called it the beginning of one. Now the most powerful man in New York's underworld, Luciano set his sights higher. He eliminated Maranzano soon after, refusing to serve another dictator. For the first time, the Mafia had no single boss of bosses. Instead, Luciano formed a governing body, the Commission, where the heads of major families could meet, vote, and settle disputes like shareholders in a company. It was a masterpiece of criminal organization, blending the discipline of the old Mafia with the pragmatism of modern capitalism. The streets changed with him. Gone were the chaotic brawls of the old days. Now, there were rules, structure, and profit sharing. Luciano's organization extended from New York to Chicago, from Cuba to Los Angeles. But the foundation of it all was built here, in the dirty, crowded streets of his youth. In those years, Lucky Luciano became more than a name. He became a symbol of evolution, the embodiment of America's dark genius, the idea that even crime, when structured, could become a kind of order. The camera pans across the skyline once again, the lights of New York shimmering like stars reflected on water. The narrator's voice lowers. In a world ruled by chaos, Luciano didn't just survive it. He organized it. The scene fades to black, and the empire he built begins to take shape, an empire born from the streets, built on ambition, and destined to one day betray him. The year was 1931, and the air in New York crackled with the tension of transformation. The city was still shaking from the aftermath of the Castellamarese War, a brutal conflict that had pitted Sicilian traditionalists against the new breed of American gangsters. The streets were quieter now, but underneath the silence ran a current of fear and opportunity. Blood had soaked the sidewalks of Little Italy, and from that blood a new order was about to rise. Standing at its center, calm and deliberate, was Lucky Luciano. He was just 34 years old, but already he saw what others could not, that chaos was a ladder, and whoever organized it would control the future. Luciano understood something revolutionary, that crime, if disciplined, could be run like a corporation. He envisioned an empire not ruled by bloodlines or old country customs, but by efficiency, profit, and pragmatism. The Mafia had always been governed by emotion, pride, vengeance, superstition. Luciano wanted logic. The wars had shown him that the old way, where one man crowned himself boss of bosses, could only lead to destruction. Instead, he proposed a system, a network of power where families shared control and disputes were resolved like business negotiations. It was democracy for criminals, and he would be its architect. To build it, he called together the most powerful men in organized crime. From Chicago came Al Capone's emissaries, from Cleveland, Buffalo, and Philadelphia came bosses with their own soldiers and smuggling routes. They met in secret hotels, behind locked doors and drawn curtains. The plan Luciano laid out was simple but profound. Every major family would have autonomy over its own territory, but all would answer to a single governing body, the Commission. It would function like a board of directors, with Luciano as its quiet chairman. Disputes would be arbitrated, assassinations would require approval, profits would be shared to avoid bloodshed. It was the birth of organized order, the transformation of gang warfare into a syndicate. Luciano's vision went beyond national borders. He and Meyer Lansky worked on financial models for laundering money through legitimate businesses, racetracks, construction, hotels, even movie studios. They began establishing offshore connections in Cuba, where corrupt officials could be paid in gold. Frank Costello became their link to politicians and union leaders, ensuring legal shields for their operations. For the first time, crime was no longer about survival, it was about sustainability. The structure of the commission was elegant. The 5 major New York families, Luciano, Mangano, Bonanno, Prophesai, and Gagliano, would each have a seat. Chicago's syndicate under Capone would represent the Midwest. Decisions would be made collectively, and no one could rule absolutely. It was an insurance policy against ego, and a guarantee of control. Luciano didn't need to be feared like a tyrant, he preferred to be respected like a chairman. His power came not from violence but from consensus, though everyone knew that defiance still carried a silent death sentence. To solidify his authority, Luciano also redefined the concept of family. In Sicily, the Mafia had been built on bloodlines and rigid loyalty. In America, that was too limiting. He opened the doors to capable men of any background, Italians, Jews, Irish, anyone who could make money and follow rules. The underworld became multicultural, interconnected, and business-oriented. He abolished the outdated initiation rites that glorified secrecy for its own sake. What mattered now was results. If you could earn, you could belong. This reformation didn't just change the Mafia, it changed America itself. Politicians began to see the Mafia not as a nuisance but as an unofficial government, capable of stabilizing neighborhoods and controlling crime through fear and order. Cops took bribes not just to look the other way but to keep the peace. Luciano's influence spread quietly, invisibly. He was the ghost in every deal, the unseen hand guiding both vice and virtue. But power always attracts attention. Newspapers began referring to him as the architect of modern crime. To the public, he was a mysterious genius who had turned murderers into managers. To the law, he was the embodiment of evil progress, too smart to catch, too connected to destroy. He understood that visibility was both a weapon and a curse. So he stayed in the shadows, appearing only at nightclubs or lavish parties where politicians and gangsters mingled as equals. Behind closed doors, he ruled with discipline. He demanded weekly accounting reports from his lieutenants. Every racket, from gambling dens to prostitution rings, had quotas and oversight. He introduced the idea of franchise operations, allowing smaller gangs to operate under his protection in exchange for a cut. His network extended beyond New York to Chicago, Miami, Kansas City, and Havana. Even European smugglers knew his name. But beneath the surface of order lay the seeds of future destruction. The more organized crime became, the more visible it was to the state. Luciano's very brilliance, his ability to transform chaos into a system, made him a target for men who believed in the law as fervently as he believed in power. Among them was a young, ambitious prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey watched Luciano's rise with both fascination and fury. To him, Luciano wasn't just a criminal, he was a symbol of everything wrong with a nation that tolerated corruption. For now, though, Luciano stood untouchable. His commission had brought peace to the underworld, his business empire flourished, and his influence reached into the highest offices of government. He had achieved what few in history ever could, absolute control disguised as cooperation. The final image of this chapter is of Luciano in his suite at the Waldorf Towers, staring out over Manhattan as if it were his personal kingdom. The city glows below him, alive and obedient. A man who once fought for scraps on the street now orchestrates an empire from the clouds. But in his reflection, for just a moment, there's a flicker of doubt, the faint awareness that no system, however perfect, can protect its creator forever. The 1930s were a paradox for Lucky Luciano. He had achieved everything a gangster could dream of, power, respect, and wealth that rivaled Wall Street moguls, yet he knew better than anyone that success was a fragile illusion. The empire he built wasn't forged in marble, it was held together by fear, loyalty, and the silence of men who profited from vice. The city he ruled was one of lights and shadows, where the line between legitimacy and crime blurred until even the most honest man could not tell where law ended and corruption began. Luciano's power reached into every corner of American life. The Mafia's hand stretched through gambling, narcotics, construction, and unions. Politicians owed him favors, judges owed him silence. In a world where morality was flexible and greed universal, Luciano thrived. But he was not reckless. His empire depended on balance, a delicate arrangement between violence and civility. He understood that the key to longevity wasn't domination, it was perception. To the public, he was an elegant businessman. To his subordinates, a patient but merciless ruler. And to his allies, a man whose word was law. Every decision he made came with a price. Luciano's transformation of organized crime into a structured enterprise required him to abandon many of the old codes. Omerta, the sacred vow of silence, was no longer just about fear, it was about efficiency. Breaking the code didn't just mean betrayal, it meant breaking the system. He knew that discipline must be absolute, that respect must be enforced with both money and death. To keep peace among predators, he had to become the ultimate predator, one who killed not for rage, but for order. This was the paradox of power. Luciano wanted to humanize crime, to run it like a business, but to do so he had to strip it of humanity. Loyalty became transactional. Love was dangerous. Every alliance he forged came with an expiration date. Even with Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, his most trusted partners, there were moments of quiet distrust. They admired each other, but they also understood that in this world, admiration could turn into fear overnight. Still, Luciano's charisma was magnetic. He knew how to make people feel indispensable, how to convince a killer that he was part of something larger, modern organization, not just a mob. He would sit in expensive suits at the Waldorf bar, discussing profit margins and logistics as if he were running a shipping company. "We're businessmen," he often said, "just like the guys downtown. Only difference is, we don't wear masks." Yet behind the glamour, his control relied on one of the darkest industries in the underworld, prostitution. Through his lieutenant, Charlie, the Ripper, workman, and later through Louis, Lepka, Buckleter and his murder-incorporated enforcement arm, Luciano organized a vast network of brothels and madams that covered the city. He regulated them with the precision of a corporate division, collecting payments, setting rules, punishing anyone who disobeyed. It was an empire built not only on vice but on the exploitation of desperation. Women became commodities, and Luciano became the silent CEO of their suffering. He didn't see it as cruelty, he saw it as business. To him, morality had long been a language for the powerless. The powerful didn't ask if something was right, they asked if it worked. His justification was pragmatic: if there's demand, someone will supply. Might as well be us. It was this cold rationality that both defined and doomed him. Because while his empire thrived, his enemies were evolving, and so was public sentiment. America in the 1930s was changing. The Great Depression had stripped away illusions of wealth and stability. People were desperate for moral certainties, and politicians began seeking easy villains to blame for the nation's decay. Newspapers painted Luciano as the face of corruption, the devil in silk. His charm and intellect, once admired, now made him seem more dangerous. He wasn't a brute like Capone, he was something far more terrifying, a criminal who could outthink the system. Luciano's relationship with the police and political elite grew increasingly tense. The very alliances that once protected him were becoming liabilities. Bribes had to grow larger. Secrets had to be buried deeper. And when whispers began that a special prosecutor was forming a task force to clean up organized vice, even Luciano felt the chill of fate closing in. In his private moments, he reflected on the irony of it all. He had wanted order, a world where business could replace bloodshed, but order demanded control, and control demanded sacrifice. He could not escape the truth that his system, however rational, was built on human pain. The girls in his brothels, the men he had silenced, the families he had destroyed, all were the price of peace. And as he looked at the shimmering lights of New York, he wondered if he had created a legacy or a machine that would one day devour him. His closest associates began to notice subtle changes. Luciano became quieter, more contemplative. He spoke often about destiny, about how every man who climbed too high eventually paid the same toll. "The higher you go," he once told Lansky, "the more you owe. Not to people, to life." Lansky, ever the realist, shrugged. "Then pay it when it comes," he said. "Until then, keep earning." But destiny was already moving toward him in the form of Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious prosecutor whose name was becoming a rallying cry for reform. Dewey represented everything Luciano despised: idealism, moral crusading, and an unshakable belief that the law could not be bent. He would soon make Luciano his ultimate prize, the man whose fall would symbolize the triumph of righteousness over corruption. As this chapter closes, the camera drifts from Luciano's suite to the crowded streets below, the neon signs flickering, the laughter of nightclubs masking the quiet transactions of power. For now, Lucky Luciano stands unchallenged, the master of an invisible empire. But somewhere in the distance, the storm is forming, and with it, the first cracks in his perfect machine. He was the kind of man who believed in order, not sympathy. Thomas Edmund Dewey, small in stature but massive in will, entered New York's legal scene like a hammer striking glass. Born in Michigan in 1902, raised by a father who believed that justice was not an idea but a duty, Dewey carried that belief like a weapon. He was meticulous, unsmiling, and relentless, a man who woke before dawn and ended his days surrounded by files, convinced that crime could be erased through logic and discipline. Where Luciano saw human nature as something to be exploited, Dewey saw it as something to be redeemed. The world around him, however, seemed designed to test that belief. By the early 1930s, New York was drowning in corruption. The Great Depression had left millions broke and bitter. Police were on the take, judges were compromised, and the city's moral foundation felt like it had been sold to the highest bidder. Politicians made promises of reform but dined secretly with mob financiers. Newspapers spoke of unseen hands pulling the strings of government, and at the center of every rumor was one name whispered with a mixture of fear and fascination, Lucky Luciano. Dewey was not a man of passion, he was a man of systems. When Governor Herbert Lehman appointed him special prosecutor to combat organized crime, Dewey saw his mission as almost biblical. He didn't want headlines, he wanted purification. His approach was revolutionary for the time. Instead of chasing low-level gangsters, he went after the infrastructure, the accountants, the lawyers, the pimps, the political fixers. He mapped crime the way an engineer maps circuits. If he could trace the flow of money, he could dismantle the empire it supported. His team worked out of a small office in Manhattan, with walls lined by maps of the city's vice districts. They built networks of informants, tapped phones, followed paper trails that most detectives would have dismissed as meaningless. Dewey's investigators moved silently through the underworld, collecting names, addresses, payoffs, and whispered rumors. For every speakeasy, every gambling den, there was a hidden ledger, and those ledgers would lead to Luciano. But Dewey knew the challenge before him. Luciano wasn't a thug like Capone, whose arrogance brought him down. He was polished, intelligent, and insulated by layers of protection. Few people could even prove Luciano ordered a crime. He had no fingerprints on violence, no direct connection to the operations he controlled. To build a case against him would require not only evidence but the unraveling of an entire myth. To the press, Dewey became a hero, the face of righteousness in a corrupt age. Editorials hailed him as the crime buster, a modern knight battling the invisible empires of vice. To the underworld, he was a threat unlike any they had faced, incorruptible, unswayable, and terrifyingly efficient. Gangsters mocked him in bars, but behind closed doors, they watched him with growing anxiety. Dewey didn't intimidate, he dismantled. Luciano, in turn, regarded Dewey with wary respect. He recognized something in the man, the same hunger for control, the same refusal to yield. "That kid's got balls," he reportedly said once, after reading about Dewey's raids. "He wants to clean up the city. Let him try." For all his confidence, though, Luciano knew that Dewey represented a different kind of danger. The prosecutor wasn't after bribes or political favors. He was after principle, and men who fight for principles never stop. The first phase of Dewey's campaign targeted the vice rackets, prostitution, gambling, and extortion. His investigations revealed a vast, intricate web connecting hundreds of brothels across the city, all paying tribute to the same central source. At first, witnesses were too terrified to talk. The Mafia's code of silence still held. But Dewey's persistence broke the pattern. He offered immunity, protection, and dignity to women who had been discarded by the underworld. Slowly, stories began to emerge, of payoffs, beatings, and collections made in Luciano's name. For Dewey, it was never about morality in the narrow sense. He didn't care if people drank or gambled, he cared that crime had become an institution. He saw Luciano's organization not as a collection of criminals but as a parallel government, one that replaced laws with fear. To dismantle it, he had to expose its inner workings to the light. The case gained momentum when one woman, a madam named Cokie Flo Brown, broke down under questioning. Her testimony revealed a hierarchy of management that led directly to Luciano's lieutenants, and eventually to Luciano himself. Dewey pounced. He ordered raids across Manhattan, shutting down brothels and seizing ledgers filled with names and figures. Each arrest tightened the net. The public watched with fascination. Newspapers turned the unfolding case into a spectacle, the righteous young prosecutor versus the sophisticated underworld king. Headlines read like pulp fiction, the crimebuster versus the king of vice. Radio commentators painted Dewey as a lone crusader standing against the corruption that had seeped into America's soul. In the courtroom of public opinion, the verdict was already clear: Luciano would fall. Meanwhile, Luciano's inner circle began to fracture. Some wanted to flee, others wanted to strike back. But Luciano, ever the strategist, decided to stay calm. He refused to run, knowing that panic would confirm guilt. He hired the best lawyers, manipulated the press, and publicly claimed innocence. "They can't touch me," he told friends. "I don't run whores. I run a business." Dewey, however, understood that this was not just about proof, it was about symbolism. He needed to show that even the most powerful man in the underworld could be dragged into the light. His preparation for the trial was methodical, bordering on obsessive. Every witness was rehearsed, every document catalogued. He built his argument like a fortress, impenetrable, logical, devastating. As the case drew near, the city felt divided, between those who admired Luciano's empire of efficiency and those who yearned for a moral cleansing. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a philosophical one. Was America built on order or ambition? On laws or survival? Luciano embodied one side of that answer, Dewey, the other. The tension between them became almost mythic. Two men born worlds apart, one from the dirt of Sicily, one from the discipline of the Midwest, now stood on a collision course. One saw control as freedom, the other saw it as corruption. Their confrontation would not just decide the fate of a man, but the future of power itself in modern America. As this section closes, the lights of Manhattan flicker over both men, Luciano at his table in the Waldorf, surrounded by laughter and smoke, Dewey in his narrow office, bent over a stack of files, eyes burning with purpose. They are mirror images of each other, two masters of systems, both believing their version of order will save the world. Only one of them will be right. The spring of 1936 arrived with a tension that could be felt in the very air of New York City. For years, Lucky Luciano had ruled its underworld like a silent monarch, his empire invisible but omnipresent, his commands whispered through the corridors of power. But now, for the first time, he could feel the walls closing in. The man who once controlled police, politicians, and street bosses alike was now the hunted one. Thomas E. Dewey's campaign had turned public opinion against him, transforming Luciano from a myth into a target. And while Luciano was too calm to show fear, those closest to him sensed the unease creeping into his world like a slow-moving fire. The first blows didn't come from bullets or raids, they came from whispers. One by one, Dewey's agents dismantled Luciano's network. Brothel owners flipped under pressure, runners disappeared, and secret ledgers fell into police hands. The empire that once ran like clockwork began to seize up, as fear replaced loyalty. Luciano prided himself on controlling his people through respect and reward, but now even respect was eroding. The old code, omerta, was dying under the heat of Dewey's moral crusade. Luciano's allies urged him to flee. He could have escaped easily, Havana was ready to receive him, and his connections in Italy would have offered protection. But Lucky refused to run. Running would mean surrendering his myth. He still believed he could outthink the system, manipulate the courts, buy time. "Let the kid try," he told Costello one night, his voice steady but his eyes distant. "Nobody's smart enough to put me in a cage." Meanwhile, Dewey's net tightened. The prosecutor's raids had crippled the prostitution rackets, but he wanted more than arrests, he wanted Luciano's name on the indictment. His team interrogated madams and enforcers day and night, breaking them down piece by piece. One by one, they began to talk, driven by a mix of fear, anger, and the promise of leniency. By the end of March, more than 200 witnesses had been questioned, and a pattern had emerged: all roads led back to Lucky Luciano. The turning point came with one woman, a small-time madam named Cokie Flo Brown, jittery, scared, and tired of running. She described in chilling detail how money from the brothels flowed upward, how enforcers collected payments for Mr. Charles, how beatings were ordered when girls refused to pay. She had never met Luciano directly, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew who was at the top. Dewey's team took her story and connected it with financial records, coded messages, and phone calls traced to Luciano's associates. The invisible web was suddenly visible. On April 1, 1936, Dewey made his move. Police stormed the Waldorf Towers, but Luciano was gone, tipped off just minutes before the raid. He had slipped out a side entrance, vanishing into the maze of New York like smoke. For a week, he was everywhere and nowhere at once, spotted in Times Square, then in Jersey, then aboard a ship to Cuba. In truth, he was already across the Hudson, holed up in a friend's mansion, surrounded by lawyers and armed guards, planning his next move. The newspapers had a field day. "King of Vice on the Run," screamed the headlines. Photos of Luciano, elegant, unbothered, smirking, filled the front pages. For the public, it was a thrilling drama, the nation's most feared criminal versus its cleanest prosecutor. But beneath the spectacle was a private war, a psychological duel between two men obsessed with control. Dewey worked around the clock. He anticipated every move, pressured every contact, and unleashed his agents on Luciano's network across the East Coast. Every associate was followed, every phone tapped. Luciano's safe houses were raided one by one until he was forced to flee south. For weeks, he lived like a ghost, drifting from town to town, relying on favors and the fading loyalty of men who once swore eternal allegiance. Finally, on April 3, a young detective spotted him at the Hot Springs Hotel in Arkansas. Luciano had been trying to arrange passage to Cuba, but fate caught up first. He was arrested quietly, without resistance. When they brought him in, he was calm, almost polite, dressed immaculately in a light gray suit. "I guess I'm lucky you found me," he said with a half-smile, the irony not lost on anyone in the room. The arrest sent shockwaves through the underworld. Every gangster in America watched as the untouchable Don was paraded before cameras in handcuffs. The image of his calm, smirking face became an emblem of pride and defiance. But behind that calm, Luciano was calculating. He had survived too much to believe the game was over. He immediately hired the most expensive legal team in the country, men who knew how to twist laws and bury evidence. He was confident he could buy or outweed his way to freedom. Dewey, however, was not dealing with an ordinary criminal trial. He treated it as a war of perception. He flooded the press with stories of moral victory, painting Luciano as the spider at the center of a web of degradation. To the public, it wasn't about brothels or money, it was about America's soul. For the first time, the people wanted blood. Inside Luciano's circle, paranoia spread like disease. Some men vanished. Others began cooperating with the state. In the dark corners of Harlem and Little Italy, whispers grew that the Luciano family might fracture without its leader. Lansky tried to stabilize operations, but the damage was already visible. The empire built on silence was now being dismantled by confession. Luciano sat in his cell awaiting trial, always composed, always dignified. But in his private reflections, written later in prison interviews, he admitted that something inside him had begun to crack. "You can buy a cop," he said, "but you can't buy a country forever." He understood that Dewey wasn't after a man, he was after an idea. And that idea was the myth of invincibility that had made Lucky Luciano larger than life. The courtroom loomed ahead like an execution chamber. Dewey was preparing his masterpiece, a case designed not just to convict but to destroy. Luciano's lawyers tried every tactic, stalling, attacking witnesses, calling the charges absurd. But deep down, everyone knew this trial would be different. For the first time in his life, Luciano wasn't playing offense. He was trapped in someone else's design, and that realization, that he was no longer the one writing the script, was more terrifying than any bullet. The section closes with a cinematic image, Luciano standing behind bars at night, his shadow stretching across the cell wall. Outside, the city he once ruled continues without him, the lights flicker, cars roar, and people gossip about his downfall. Yet somewhere deep in his eyes, there's still defiance. He's not done. He never is. The man who built the modern Mafia isn't ready to die quietly. But for the first time, he begins to understand what it means to lose control. Dannemora Prison, nicknamed Little Siberia, by those unlucky enough to be sent there, stood like a fortress carved into the cold mountains of upstate New York. Its gray stone walls rose against the winter sky, crowned with barbed wire and watchtowers. Inside, the air smelled of rust, sweat, and resignation. This was where the state sent men to be forgotten, and in 1936, that's exactly what it intended for Charles, Lucky, Luciano. He arrived there in manacles, escorted by guards who looked at him with a mixture of awe and contempt. To them, he was the devil in a tailored suit, the man who had corrupted half of New York. To the press, he was a fallen king, his empire dissolved, his arrogance punished. But to Luciano himself, prison wasn't death. It was just another kind of battlefield, one with different weapons. He had survived beatings, betrayals, and bullets before. This time, he would survive silence. At first, the adjustment was brutal. The cells were cold and narrow, the food barely edible. Inmates worked long hours breaking rocks or sewing uniforms. The guards enjoyed testing him, calling him the big shot and giving him the dirtiest jobs. They expected him to break, to rage, to fight. But Luciano did none of those things. He adapted. He watched, listened, and waited, the same way he always had on the streets. Within weeks, he had mapped the prison's hierarchy the way he once mapped the streets of Manhattan. He learned who controlled the black market for cigarettes, who smuggled in liquor, who could get messages in or out. Power, he discovered, existed everywhere, even behind bars. He began building influence quietly. When guards needed information or favors, Luciano provided them. When inmates needed protection or a loan of cigarettes, he arranged it. He created small debts, invisible threads of control, and soon those threads became a web. By the end of his first year, even the warden knew better than to underestimate him. Luciano never shouted or threatened, he negotiated. In time, he transformed his cell into a sort of office, receiving visitors, writing letters, and managing communications with the outside world. Though officially cut off, Luciano never truly lost control of his empire. Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, both still free, continued running operations with his blessing. Through coded letters and smuggled notes, Luciano approved deals, settled disputes, and maintained discipline. He had turned prison into a boardroom. The guards who searched his cell for evidence of crime found nothing, just books, letters, and a neatly folded handkerchief embroidered with his initials. Yet beneath the surface of this calm, Luciano wrestled with something new, isolation. For the first time in his life, he was alone, no bodyguards, no noise, no lights of the city. Nights were the worst. The silence pressed against him like a weight, forcing him to face thoughts he had long buried. He remembered the streets of his youth, his parents' faces, the people he had betrayed or killed in the pursuit of order. For years, he had told himself that power justified everything, that cruelty was just efficiency. But in the dark, stripped of wealth and title, those justifications began to sound hollow. He started reading history, philosophy, even poetry. Plato, Machiavelli, Marcus Aurelius. He was fascinated by men who ruled empires only to lose them, by kings who were remembered not for their victories but for their downfalls. One guard later recalled seeing Luciano sitting by the window of his cell for hours, staring at the snow, a book open in his lap. He looked like a man thinking about everything and nothing, the guard said. Like someone who'd finally realized the price of what he built. But reflection didn't make him weak. It made him sharper. Luciano began to see prison as the ultimate test of control, not over others, but over himself. He couldn't manipulate the world from a cell, but he could master patience. He could wait for the right moment, and he knew history always provided one. No empire stays down forever, he told a visiting priest once. Even Rome rose again. I'll get my chance. Maybe not soon, but I will. That chance came sooner than he could have imagined, in the form of a world at war. By 1941, the United States had entered World War II. The oceans became battlegrounds, and the East Coast's shipping lanes turned into hunting grounds for German U-boats. America's docks were crucial to the war effort, but they were also corrupt, infiltrated by saboteurs and informants. When mysterious fires began breaking out along the New York waterfront, panic spread through Washington. The Navy needed someone who could bring order to the chaos, someone who understood the criminal networks that controlled the docks. And in a twist of fate almost too poetic to be real, the man who fit that description best was sitting in a cell in Dannemora. Inside the prison walls, Luciano heard rumors first. He smiled but said nothing. The government, the same government that condemned him, would soon come knocking. He knew it. America was desperate, and desperation bends even the highest morals. It was only a matter of time before they needed his reach, his influence, his understanding of the underworld. Still, the days dragged on. He maintained his routines, exercise at dawn, letters in the afternoon, reading at night. To other inmates, he was a mystery, quiet, polite, rarely speaking about his past. But when newcomers arrived, they sought him out instinctively, drawn to his calm authority. He gave advice, settled disputes, and kept the peace among the restless men. Even behind bars, he ruled by logic, not fear. When the first representatives from naval intelligence finally visited the prison in 1942, Luciano didn't act surprised. He welcomed them like guests, offering cigarettes and measured words. He listened as they described their problem: sabotage, spies, and chaos on the docks. He nodded slowly, as though hearing an echo of his own philosophy. Order had collapsed, and now the system that tried to destroy him wanted his help to rebuild it. For years, he had believed that power was a circle, that those on top eventually fell, and those who fell could rise again. Now, sitting across from uniformed officers, he saw that circle complete. The very law that caged him was about to rely on the criminal it despised. And as he signed the first notes of cooperation, Luciano thought not of redemption but of irony. "The country finally needs me," he murmured later to a fellow inmate. "Took them long enough to figure out I'm good for business." The section ends on that quiet, chilling note, the image of Luciano in his cell, pen in hand, writing letters that would change the course of history. Outside, snow falls softly against the prison bars. Inside, the man once branded as a parasite is about to become a patriot, or at least, something that looks like one. The year was 1942, and America was a nation gripped by fear. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor just months earlier, plunging the United States into a global war. The Atlantic coast was no longer safe. German submarines prowled the waters, sinking merchant ships with deadly precision. Every week brought new headlines of ships ablaze just miles from New York Harbor, the water slick with oil and corpses. Panic spread among sailors and dockworkers. Rumors of Nazi spies infiltrating the ports ran wild. The U.S. Navy faced a terrifying possibility, that enemy agents had compromised the docks, and that New York, the nation's lifeline, was vulnerable from within. The Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence, desperate and stretched thin, began looking for help where no one ever thought they would, inside the underworld. The Mafia had always ruled the docks. Longshoremen, union heads, and smugglers answered to them, not the government. No federal agent could walk into those neighborhoods without a dozen pairs of eyes watching. The Navy knew it. The FBI knew it. Everyone knew it. If they wanted to protect the harbor, they would need the cooperation of organized crime. And there was only one man whose reach extended from the cells of Dannemora to the piers of Manhattan, Lucky Luciano. The idea seemed insane at first, treasonous, even. To enlist the help of a convicted crime boss in a military operation was to admit moral defeat. But war doesn't wait for morality. The Navy had tried everything else, arrests, surveillance, secret raids, nothing worked. The fires kept breaking out, the sabotage continued. Finally, a Navy officer named Charles Haffenden proposed a radical plan: make contact with the Mafia through their known intermediaries and see if they would cooperate in securing the docks. The operation would be classified, its details buried under layers of secrecy. They called it Operation Underworld. The first meetings were cautious, almost surreal. Naval officers in crisp uniforms sat across from shadowy figures in smoke-filled rooms, discussing the defense of the United States like partners in a business deal. Through Meyer Lansky, who acted as a go-between, the Navy sent a message to Luciano. They wanted peace on the docks, information about Axis sympathizers, and assurance that no more ships would burn. In return, they offered consideration, leniency, perhaps, or better conditions in prison. The terms were vague, but the implication was clear: the government was ready to deal. When the proposal reached Luciano, he listened silently. For years, he had been waiting for the moment when America's need would outweigh its pride. Now it had come. They finally figured out who runs the waterfront, he said with a faint smile. He agreed to cooperate, not out of patriotism, but out of instinct. He understood leverage, and he knew this was the kind of opportunity that came only once in a lifetime. The arrangement was simple but effective. From his prison cell, Luciano communicated through intermediaries, Lansky, Costello, and Joseph Sox Lanza, a powerful fish market union boss with deep ties to the docks. Lanza ensured that Mafia-controlled unions would maintain discipline, prevent strikes, and watch for suspicious activity. In return, the Navy turned a blind eye to certain operations. The underworld, for the first time, became a shadow extension of the U.S. war effort. And it worked. Almost overnight, the fires on the docks stopped. Sabotage reports dwindled. Longshoremen began cooperating with naval investigators, quietly identifying troublemakers and foreign agents. Even the U-boats seemed to vanish farther out to sea. Officially, the Navy took credit for improved surveillance. Unofficially, everyone knew who to thank. The Mafia had made the docks run like a machine, disciplined, silent, efficient. Luciano's influence reached even further than the Navy expected. Through his network in Sicily, intelligence began to flow about Axis movements in the Mediterranean. When the Allies prepared to invade Sicily in 1943 under Operation Husky, that information proved invaluable. The Mafia's local connections helped guide Allied troops through treacherous mountain passes and into villages where resistance collapsed without a fight. It was as if invisible hands were clearing the path before them. The Americans advanced quickly, seizing the island in weeks. Later, when asked how they managed it, some officers simply said, "We had friends on the ground." In truth, those friends were the remnants of Luciano's old world, Sicilian families who saw opportunity in aligning with the victorious Americans. Their cooperation would have lasting consequences, planting the seeds for a post-war Mafia resurgence in Italy. But for now, the U.S. military didn't care about future corruption. They cared only about victory, and Luciano had delivered. Inside Dannemora, his conditions changed subtly. Guards treated him with quiet respect. He was moved to a less restrictive wing, given better food, allowed visitors more freely. Navy officers came and went under the cover of secrecy, carrying updates and requests. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same man the government once condemned as the symbol of corruption was now, in some classified reports, being praised as instrumental to the success of port security operations. Dewey, now New York's district attorney, was aware of the arrangement, and it infuriated him. The man he had built his career prosecuting was being quietly rehabilitated by the same government he served. But Dewey was also a realist. The war came first, and if the Mafia could keep the docks safe, even righteousness had its price. He didn't like it, but he didn't stop it. Luciano's cooperation remained officially secret, but in the underworld, word spread quickly. His legend grew tenfold. Even in prison, he commanded respect that no free man could match. To his followers, he was untouchable, the man who made America kneel. He didn't brag or boast, he didn't have to. His enemies whispered about him in disbelief. How could a man behind bars still bend history to his will? But beneath the triumph, there was irony, and loneliness. Luciano knew his help was transactional. When the war ended, the same people shaking his hand would turn their backs again. He wasn't a patriot, he was a tool of necessity. And tools, no matter how valuable, are eventually put away. He once told Lansky in a letter, "They need me now, but don't mistake that for respect. A man like me will never be forgiven, only used." Still, he took satisfaction in knowing he had outwitted them all. He had turned imprisonment into power, disgrace into influence. From the cold stone of his cell, he reached across oceans and shaped the course of war. The world saw him as a relic of the past, but Luciano was always ahead of his time. He understood that survival wasn't about winning, it was about remaining useful. As the war drew to a close in 1945, whispers began to circulate that the Navy intended to reward him quietly. There was talk of a pardon, or at least a reduction of his sentence. To the public, it would seem outrageous, to insiders, it was the price of silence. The Mafia had saved the docks, safeguarded the war effort, and aided the invasion of Sicily, all under the command of a prisoner. The final image of this chapter is striking, the grey walls of Dannemora glowing faintly under the evening sun, and inside, Lucky Luciano sitting at his small desk, cigarette in hand, reading the latest newspaper reports about the Allied victories in Europe. His lips curl into a faint, knowing smile. The world has changed, but not the game. He may still be locked behind bars, but once again, it's Luciano, not the law, who has the upper hand. The war ended in 1945, and with it came the uneasy peace that always follows catastrophe. The world celebrated victory, but in the shadows, quieter reckonings began. Deals made in desperation were now secrets too shameful to speak aloud. Operation Underworld was one such secret, buried in confidential files, sealed away from the public, and officially denied by every branch of government. Yet among the powerful few who knew the truth, there was a silent understanding, Lucky Luciano had done something extraordinary. He had helped safeguard America's war effort, and in doing so, he had earned a debt the nation was reluctant to admit. The question was not whether to repay him, but how. For Thomas E. Dewey, now governor of New York, the situation was intolerable. The man he had built his reputation destroying, the man whose conviction made Dewey a national hero, had somehow transformed himself into a secret ally of the United States Navy. It was an inversion of everything Dewey believed in. To him, justice was sacred, the law absolute. But to the Navy and certain federal officials, the law was just another instrument of necessity. In their eyes, Luciano's cooperation had saved lives. They didn't see a gangster, they saw a resource. The negotiations began quietly in late 1945. Representatives from naval intelligence approached the New York state authorities, suggesting a review of Luciano's sentence. They couched their language in patriotic terms, acknowledging his indirect assistance to the Allied cause and recommending clemency, in recognition of extraordinary circumstances. They never mentioned Operation Underworld by name, but everyone understood. It was the unspoken debt. Luciano's lawyers seized the opportunity. They petitioned the state for a commutation, citing his good behavior, his age, and his alleged contributions to the war effort. The motion was carefully worded, patriotic, respectable, and vague enough to protect all parties. Dewey resisted at first, furious that his legacy might be undone by backroom deals. But pressure built from every direction: naval officers, federal prosecutors, and even foreign intelligence figures quietly urged him to approve the request. To refuse, they implied, would expose wartime secrets the government couldn't afford to reveal. By early 1946, the matter had become inevitable. Dewey summoned his advisors and reviewed the classified reports himself. The evidence was clear: Luciano had indeed provided assistance, indirectly but effectively. He had delivered results when no one else could. The docks were secure, and intelligence from Sicily had saved Allied troops. Dewey's conscience raged, but his pragmatism won. History, he realized, had cornered him. On February 3, 1946, the governor signed the order commuting Luciano's sentence to time served, on the condition that he be deported immediately to Italy. The state's official explanation was carefully crafted, praising his wartime cooperation while insisting that his presence in America was incompatible with the welfare of the nation. In essence, Luciano was both honored and exiled, rewarded and erased. When the news broke, America was stunned. Headlines screamed across front pages: "Lucky Luciano freed, deported to Italy." Politicians demanded answers, veterans groups protested, and moral crusaders condemned Dewey for releasing the embodiment of organized vice. The governor, in his public statement, remained stoic. He described the commutation as a matter of state interest and refused to elaborate. But in private, he told an aide, "I didn't free him. I just removed him from our problem." In the corridors of power, however, everyone knew the truth: the government had made a deal with the devil and now wanted him gone before anyone could ask why. Luciano's release from prison was as quiet as his fall had been loud. He emerged thinner, older, his hair silvering at the edges, but his eyes were still sharp, calculating, alive. Reporters shouted questions as he was led out of the gates under heavy guard. "Any regrets, Lucky?" one called out. Luciano stopped for just a moment, the faintest smile flickering on his lips. "Only that I didn't charge more," he said, and walked on. From Dannemora, he was transferred to Ellis Island, the same place he had first entered America as a hopeful 9-year-old immigrant decades earlier. The symmetry was poetic, a beginning and an ending in the same building. But this time, he wasn't arriving to chase dreams, he was leaving to pay for them. As he stood at the dock awaiting deportation, he gazed across the water at the skyline of New York, the city he had conquered, corrupted, and, in some strange way, served. It shimmered in the morning light, indifferent to him. Luciano's departure was both tragic and theatrical. Crowds gathered at the pier, some to cheer, others to jeer. To the public, he was still the legendary Don, the man who had ruled the underworld with brains instead of bullets. To the government, he was a necessary embarrassment, a ghost they needed gone. And to himself, he was something else entirely, a survivor once again outmaneuvering fate. On February 10, 1946, the ship Laura Keene left New York Harbor with Luciano aboard, escorted by immigration officials. As the vessel pulled away, he stood on deck in a long overcoat, smoking a cigarette, watching the city shrink into the horizon. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. In that moment, he seemed carved from stone, the final act of a man who refused to let the world see him broken. But beneath the surface, there was bitterness. In his later recollections, he spoke of that day as the loneliest moment of my life. America had used him, then cast him aside. The Navy officers who once shook his hand were nowhere to be found. The politicians who owed him quiet gratitude now denied ever knowing his name. Even Meyer Lansky, ever the pragmatist, had warned him before he left, "Charlie, you helped them win a war. But they'll never let you forget what you are." Still, Luciano couldn't resist a final act of irony. As he disembarked in Naples weeks later, reporters surrounded him again, eager for a quote. "What will you do now, Lucky?" one shouted. He smiled faintly. "I'm retired," he said. "But business is business. You never really stop working, you just change offices." Behind him, the Italian port buzzed with life, black market traders, ex-soldiers, and young gangsters eager for a leader. The man America had exiled was already becoming a myth in the land of his birth. For Dewey, the episode marked a bitter victory. He had protected his reputation, maintained the illusion of justice, and preserved national secrecy. But history would always remember that the righteous prosecutor had once freed the king of crime. Privately, he called it a necessary compromise. Publicly, he never mentioned Luciano again. In the end, Operation Underworld vanished from official records, hidden under classifications and silence. It would take decades for the truth to emerge, that in the darkest hours of war, the U.S. had made a pact with the very man it condemned as evil. As this section closes, the scene fades to the deck of the ship again, the Atlantic stretching endlessly around it. Luciano stands at the railing, the wind whipping at his coat, the smoke from his cigarette curling upward like a ghost. The voiceover lingers, the man who built an empire of vice had saved a nation from fear, and in return, they gave him freedom in exile. Justice, perhaps. Or maybe just balance. Naples in 1946 was a city broken and reborn. The war had ended, but the scars still ran deep, bombed-out buildings, hungry faces, and streets alive with the chaos of reconstruction. American soldiers lounged in cafes beside black market peddlers and former partisans. The line between order and crime was as thin as cigarette paper, and into this fragile, fertile landscape stepped a man who embodied both worlds, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. When he arrived, Italy barely knew what to make of him. The local newspapers called him the American gangster, the deported king of crime, and the man who beat death. To many Italians, he was a legend out of rumor, part truth, part ghost. To the American authorities who had exiled him, he was a problem conveniently removed. But for the underworld, his return was something close to prophecy. Sicily and southern Italy had always revered their own kind, and Luciano, the Sicilian who had conquered America, became an icon of possibility. Yet behind the legend was a man weary of illusions. Prison and betrayal had changed him. His body was older, slower, and though his mind remained sharp, there was a gravity in his movements, a calm that came not from peace but from exhaustion. "I ain't looking to be no boss again," he told a reporter in Naples. "I did my job. I paid my price." But the truth, as always with Lucky Luciano, was more complicated. Within weeks of his arrival, the old network began to reassemble around him. Men from Palermo, Naples, and Rome sought him out, emissaries of the old families, black market traders, ex-soldiers turned smugglers. The post-war economy was a feeding frenzy. Cigarettes, medicine, liquor, and food, all were scarce, all valuable, all moving through underground channels. Luciano, even in exile, was a man who understood logistics better than any general. His knowledge of smuggling routes, shipping contacts, and financial systems was unmatched. It didn't take long before whispers began, the American Don was back in business. At first, he operated from the shadows. Officially, he lived quietly in a seaside villa near Naples, funded by savings and business ventures. Unofficially, he oversaw the flow of contraband goods from North Africa and the U.S. Army's surplus stockpiles. He worked through intermediaries, men like Calogero Vizzini in Sicily and Don Antonio Gallo in Naples, letting them take public risks while he remained the invisible hand. The war had left Europe in ruins, but ruins are fertile ground for those who know how to plant. Meanwhile, his connections in America were far from severed. Through a network of couriers and coded letters, Luciano stayed in touch with Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, who had taken firm control of the American syndicate. Together, they were orchestrating a new frontier: legal gambling, narcotics trade, and investments in Las Vegas. Luciano couldn't set foot on American soil, but his influence reached across the ocean. It was as if his empire had split in two: the American branch, sleek and modern, and the European one, raw and untamed. But exile had its price. In America, time moves fast, and memory fades even faster. New faces were rising: Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and others who had once served under him now claimed pieces of his old empire. Luciano watched from afar as they maneuvered for dominance, his control weakening with every passing year. Letters from Lansky grew shorter, more formal, and the money transfers less frequent. The underworld he had built was evolving without him, modernizing in ways that no longer needed a patriarch. He filled the void with routine. Days spent walking along the harbor, nights in cafes where jazz spilled from jukeboxes. Sometimes, he entertained visitors, writers, curious foreigners, or minor gangsters eager to pay homage. They all asked the same question: did he regret it? Luciano would smile faintly and answer, "You can't regret what you built. Only what it cost." Yet despite his calm exterior, a restlessness haunted him. He missed New York, not the money, not even the power, but the rhythm. The city was his creation, his reflection. In Italy, he was a legend living in someone else's story. Even the Italian police didn't know what to do with him. They watched, trailed, interrogated, but could never pin him to anything. He was too smart, too discreet. Every time they thought they had proof, it vanished into smoke. The Americans pressured Rome to keep an eye on him, fearing he might reignite international narcotics trafficking. But all they ever found was an aging man who spent his days drinking espresso and feeding stray cats by the sea. Still, the rumors persisted, that he had rebuilt the global drug network, that heroin was moving again through Sicily, Marseille, and New York under his orders. No one could prove it, but the timing was suspicious. The so-called French Connection, a vast narcotics route between Europe and America, began to take shape in these very years. Many historians later believed Luciano was its unseen architect, orchestrating the trade as a means of regaining relevance. Whether that was truth or myth no longer mattered, the myth was enough. In private, Luciano's health was beginning to fail. Decades of stress, prison food, and heavy smoking had worn down his heart. But he remained defiant. "I was born with a price on my head," he once said to a friend. "If I go out quiet, it means I lost." His days alternated between nostalgia and paranoia. He would reread old clippings about Dewey, rewatch American newsreels, and talk about the old days when men like Lansky and Siegel ruled the night. "They're all businessmen now," he'd mutter. "No guts, no soul. They forgot the street." Ironically, even as he longed for relevance, Luciano's legend was growing beyond anything he could have imagined. Hollywood began romanticizing the Mafia, turning his life into pulp novels and films. Young gangsters quoted him as scripture. To them, he wasn't a criminal, he was the founder, the lawgiver, the man who turned chaos into empire. He was the ghost haunting every backroom deal, every whispered oath. And yet, for all his power, Luciano was still a prisoner, this time not of walls, but of memory. He couldn't return to America, and Italy, though it revered him, never truly accepted him. He was an exile in both worlds, too American for Sicily, too Sicilian for America. In the winter of 1958, he made one last attempt to reclaim some control over his story. He began meeting with a Hollywood producer who wanted to make a film about his life. The meetings were cautious, almost therapeutic. Luciano saw it as a way to define his legacy, to tell his story before others twisted it beyond recognition. But even this plan carried risk. The police began tailing him again, suspecting that the film deal was a cover for narcotics negotiations. Every move he made, every visitor he received, was recorded and reported to Rome and Washington. He laughed about it often. "I could be dying, and they'd still think I'm selling dope," he joked to a friend. But behind the laughter was fatigue. He knew his time was running out. "The funny thing about power," he once said, "is that you only know you had it when it's gone." The section closes on a soft image, Luciano walking along the Neapolitan pier at sunset, the sea stretching endless and golden before him. Fishermen call out to one another in the distance, a boy runs past, chasing a ball. Luciano pauses to light a cigarette, the flame flickering against his lined face. He looks out toward the horizon, toward America, as though he might see it again if he stares long enough. The waves crash softly, indifferent, eternal. For the first time, he looks small against the vastness of the world he once thought he could control. By the early 1960s, Lucky Luciano lived as both legend and exile. Naples had become his stage and his cage, a city alive with rebuilding, black markets, and whispers of his past. The locals knew him as the American gentleman, a polite man in tailored suits who tipped generously and spoke little about who he had been. But in the underworld, his name still carried weight, half myth, half warning. He was no longer the powerful Don who once ruled New York, yet men from across Italy and beyond still sought him out. They came to his seaside apartment, smugglers, young mafiosi, foreign visitors, all drawn to the legend who had turned crime into empire. Luciano listened more than he spoke. "Don't make it about fear," he would tell them. "Make it about respect. Fear doesn't last." It was advice from a man who knew how power fades. Officially, he was retired. In reality, he still moved invisible pieces, helping organize shipments, connecting old allies, advising on deals that stretched from Naples to New York. He never stopped working, he simply worked quieter. But exile was its own kind of punishment. The America he had conquered had erased him, his empire absorbed by younger men who no longer needed his wisdom. Lansky wrote occasionally, Costello sent money, but the world had moved on. Age brought reflection. He walked the Naples harbor each morning, always dressed as if for a meeting that would never come. He read American papers, watched tourists disembark from ships, and sometimes smiled at the irony. Once he had ruled these men's destinies, now they passed him without a glance. Nights were quieter, spent with wine, jazz records, and memory. "Everything I built," he told a friend once, "was just a way to stop feeling small." Still, the legend persisted. Police watched him, convinced he was rebuilding the heroin trade, though they never proved it. To some, he was still the mastermind behind the French Connection, to others, just an old man feeding stray cats by the sea. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Luciano had become what he always feared, a ghost surrounded by his own myth. Yet even ghosts crave control. In 1962, he agreed to meet Martin Gosch, an American film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. Luciano saw in it one last chance, to tell his own story, to define the man behind the name. They met discreetly in hotel lobbies and cafes, the old Don recounting his rise, fall, and philosophies. "I wasn't a saint," he told Gosch, "but I was never stupid. I made order where there was none." Gosch listened, fascinated, unaware that authorities were already watching them. The Italian police believed the film talks were a cover for criminal dealings. The Americans worried that the story might expose Operation Underworld, the wartime secret everyone wanted buried. Luciano, amused by their paranoia, kept meeting Gosch anyway. For once, he wanted to be understood, not feared. "The difference between me and them," he said, "is that I never lied about what I was." On January 26, 1962, Luciano arrived at Naples International Airport to meet Gosch once more. It was a bright, clear morning. He stepped from his car immaculate as ever, gray suit, silk tie, cigarette between his fingers. Witnesses remember him smiling, shaking hands, looking healthy for his age. Then, without warning, his face went pale. He reached for his chest, stumbled, and collapsed to the marble floor. By the time help arrived, he was gone, a massive heart attack, instantaneous and final. He was 64. The news raced across the world. Lucky Luciano dead in Naples, the headlines read. In America, the tone was colder, exiled mob boss dies. To the public, it was the quiet end of a notorious figure. To those who understood history, it was the closing of an era. His body was flown to New York, a city that had once crowned and condemned him, and buried in Queens. As the coffin lowered into the ground, a friend whispered, "He made order out of chaos," but in the end, chaos took him back. The camera lingers on the grave. The world moves on, but his story refuses to rest. After Lucky Luciano's death, his name didn't fade, it evolved into legend. The man who once ruled New York's underworld became a ghost that history couldn't bury. To some, he was a visionary who brought logic to chaos, to others, the embodiment of corruption disguised as genius. But above all, he was proof that order and crime could share the same language. The commission he built survived him, shaping organized crime for decades. Its rules, cooperation over conflict, business over blood, echoed his genius. Yet as new generations rose, the discipline he enforced gave way to ego and spectacle. By the 1980s, the Mafia he had structured like a corporation began to crumble under its own weight. Luciano's design outlived him, but without his restraint, it devoured itself. Outside the underworld, his myth grew stronger. Scholars and filmmakers turned him into a symbol of ambition, control, and the American dream's dark reflection. He wasn't just a gangster, he was the mirror image of the society that produced him, ruthless, pragmatic, and endlessly ambitious. Luciano had once said, "Everybody wants something, you just have to find out what they'll give to get it." That simple philosophy defined not just his empire, but the psychology of power itself. He built a world where morality was negotiable and loyalty had a price, a world that didn't vanish when he died. It simply put on a suit and called itself business. His life proved one thing: power never disappears. It only changes shape. And somewhere in every system built on ambition, a little of Lucky Luciano's shadow still lingers. The story of Lucky Luciano ends not with redemption, but reflection. His secret wartime pact, the deal that saved him from dying behind bars, remains one of history's great paradoxes. The U.S. government, desperate to win a war, had turned to the very man it once condemned. Morality bowed to necessity, and justice blurred into compromise. Operation Underworld was buried after the war, its files sealed, its truth denied. But time exposed the irony: America's victory had quietly depended on its own criminal. Luciano, the so-called enemy of order, had become its silent ally. It was the final proof of his philosophy, that power, no matter who wields it, always negotiates with corruption when survival is on the line. Luciano's life was more than the rise and fall of a gangster, it was the story of civilization's reflection in its own shadow. He understood what most refused to admit, that the systems of law, business, and crime were built from the same human instincts: greed, fear, and ambition. His legacy is not carved in crime, but in revelation. He showed that order is often born from corruption, and that no system, not even justice, is untouched by the deals it makes to survive. The camera fades on his grave in Queens, the city skyline glowing faintly beyond it. The narrator's voice softens: he was neither hero nor villain, but the space between, the truth we pretend not to see. Some men change history by breaking the rules. Lucky Luciano changed it by proving there were none.